In this video, we are going to learn how to bake a high poly ZBrush sculpt onto a low poly mesh using Substance Painter. Before we take our model to Substance Painter, I just want to show you how I prepare my models for baking. You can see here in my outliner that I have two versions of my model. Let's look at what they look like. So here is my low poly version that has good topology, as optimized as I could make it. I'm still working on the topology, so there are some things I would change, but this is my low poly version. And I have my high poly version from ZBrush, which has all my normal map detail that I want to bake onto the low poly. When making these versions, I make sure that the naming is consistent. So if I have a part right here, top handle low, I make sure I have a corresponding high poly counterpart. The same thing applies for every single mesh in the low and the high. This is very important because when we're baking in Substance Painter, we are going to bake by name. And if Substance Painter can't find the name of these meshes, it will not bake correctly. Even for objects that I haven't sculpted on, like this part of the model, for example, I still have a mesh named underscore high and a mesh named underscore low. This is because I'm going to bake this entire asset in one Substance Painter file, and I want to make sure Substance can find all these meshes when it is baking. If you're bringing in your model from ZBrush and you want to quickly add suffixes to your names, you can use Maya's native naming tool. Let me show you how that works. So if I go to Modify and Search and Replace Names, it opens up this box. And if I want to add a suffix at the end of any name, I can select these objects and search for $. That just searches for the space at the end of your name. And I can replace it with underscore high. And if you replace the names for everything that's selected, you'll get expected results. And then you hit apply. You can see that it added that suffix to all of my objects. This is why I bring my models from ZBrush into Maya before baking so that I can check all these things and make sure that my meshes and my names match up correctly. I am just going to undo this because I have already named all my objects, and now I'm going to export these files as FBXs for Substance Painter. When I do this, I just select the low to a file export selection, and I'm going to save it in a location. In this location, I am just going to type in that's my low poly, and I am going to export my high poly by going to File, Export Selection. It is important to note that your high poly mesh does not need to contain UVs, but my low poly mesh, which I'm going to go to the UV editor and show you what that looks like, does have UVs. Now let's go into Substance Painter and see how this naming is going to help us. In Substance Painter, I'm just going to make a new file with my low poly mesh selected. So I'm going to go to File, New, select my mesh. I'm going to use the UV tile workflow because I have UV tiles, and I'm going to click on OK. Now this is my low poly mesh without any of the sculpted detail. Let me go to baking, and if you have a high poly mesh, this is where you bring in your mesh. So I'm going to click on that and bring in my high FBX. When you're baking, you want to make sure that you don't have any red parts on your mesh. You want to edit this maximum frontal distance till everything is completely blue. If your meshes are sculpted correctly and are at a good distance from each other, you will be getting something that's good at the default setting. So I'm going to make sure this is okay. And to start off with, let's bake this at the default and see what we get. This is my bake at the default setting, And you can see that I get some artifacting where these meshes are super close to each other, like over here where these meshes are touching, and here where I'm getting the shadow on this mesh over here as well. And this artifacting is due to these objects baking on top of each other. So let's go back to our baking and see how our names can help us. If you scroll down in this setting, you can see that our match for baking is set to always. And then you have another option here, which is by mesh name. This is what we want to do if we don't want our objects to bake onto each other. So if I match it by mesh name and have a low poly suffix and high poly suffix, Substance Painter is going to find those names that we created in Maya, all of these names, and it's going to look for the suffixes low for your low poly mesh and high for your high poly mesh. So I'm going to match my mesh name. And when you do this, you also need to change this setting in 3 of your maps. So I'm going to go to thickness and change this to only say mesh name, do the same for curvature and for ambient occlusion. And now, when you do that, you will be able to match your baking by mesh name, so the meshes will not bake onto each other. Let's bake selected textures. So my bake is done, but I just wanted to show you this section of matching my name. If you have any errors, it's going to show up on this little with this little triangle right here. But for me, because I've named everything correctly, I don't have any errors. It just bakes my high poly mesh for that particular object onto my low poly mesh. So let's go back to my painting mode and see what that gives us. So you see here that I get a much cleaner bake. I don't have those ambient occlusion artifacts that I had earlier, and my objects are just baking onto themselves. This is a really useful thing to know when you are using Substance Painter because you can then choose how you want to bake objects. This is also another reason that we keep our meshes separate because if I had attached these objects or combined them into a single mesh, I wouldn't be able to bake them separately. So when you're combining meshes in Maya, just be aware of objects that are close together, objects that you want to bake separately, and combine meshes only when necessary.